Welcome today. I often say good morning, but it's evening and all different times everywhere. My name is Stephanie Hagstrom, and I'm the Director of Community Development at the Research Data Alliance US, and I'll be the host of today's webinar. Before we get started, we do have a little bit of information about RDA that I want to share with you and some housekeeping, and then we'll get started. So the Research Data Alliance is a community of over 12,500 data experts from 147 countries around the globe. They all collaborate and build the social and technical bridges to enable open sharing and reuse of data. Members of the RDA come together through self-formed focus working groups, exploratory interest groups, and communities of practice groups to exchange knowledge and discoveries, to discuss barriers and potential solutions, and define policies and test standards. Many of the 86 groups have produced outputs to enhance and facilitate global data sharing and reuse. The RDA also has 30 national groups that support initiatives of the RDA members in those areas by providing a platform to interact on a global level. Those national groups may be individual countries or a group of countries. For instance, there's a region of the Americas, which includes all countries within North America and Latin America. There are also 4 contributing regions, France, Australia, the EU, and the United States, who each provide the resources that support and sustain the global operations. The RDA US, who's the host of today's webinar, is one of those recognized regions and is represented by 2,600 members who help strengthen the data science infrastructure community. In addition to the 4 contributing regions, there are also 57 organizational members who also help sustain the organization global operations, and there are 12 affiliate members that support the RDA in a variety of ways. We're really excited about this, that today's webinar will be translated from English into French. If you wish to listen to the French interpretation, please select the globe on your control screen. We'll be recording both in English and in French, and those recordings will be put on the RDA webinar webpage after the event. And we've allotted time at the end of the webinar for questions. There's 3 ways you can ask questions. You can raise your hand and I will unmute you and you can ask questions verbally, or you can post the Q&A section of Zoom, or you can post questions to chat. Okay, that's it for housekeeping. It is now my pleasure to introduce the tools and resources for data usage metrics webinar, which is hosted, as mentioned above, the RDA US, and it's presented by the RDA Data Usage Metrics Working Group. Okay, so each one of the presenters has their camera on. I'd like to introduce you now. Our first speaker today will be Ian Bruno, Director of Data Initiatives at the Cambridge Crystallographic Data Center, CCDC, in the United Kingdom. Our second presenter today will be Daniela Lowenberg, the Senior Data Publishing Product Manager and Make Data Principal Investigator at the UC Curation Center, UC3, at the University of California, Office of the President in the United States. Our third and fourth presenter are both from DataCite. Matt Bies is the Executive Director of DataCite, and Christian Garza is the Product Designer at DataCite in Germany. I am pleased to turn the mic over to Ian to get things started, and thank you all for being here.
And thank you, Stephanie. Can you hear me?
I can. So I'm going to ask all the other presenters to stop their video, and we'll have Ian showing, and you can share your slides.
Excellent. And can you see my first slide?
We can.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, and thank you for organizing this event and providing this opportunity for us to share with RDA US and its community the work that took place in the RDA Data Usage Metrics Working Group. Now, this group began in Berlin in 2018. And the starting proposition was that adoption of data usage metrics was necessary to help recognize research data as a first-class research output. and that researchers, funders, publishers, and institutions would all benefit from metrics that importantly reliably reflect impact. And this started then a journey that took us to Africa, across to the US, and then back to Europe, and sessions held at successive RDA plenary meetings, where discussions took place about this challenge of establishing reliable ways of reporting data usage metrics. There are a couple of sort of main strands to this, I think. One was a survey that we undertook in 2019 that was quite well responded to by data repositories, where we were asking them about what activities they were doing in this area of data usage metrics, their interest in providing services around that, and questions about barriers and concerns to actually implementing this. The other strand of discussion was around some of the potential pitfalls that might arise when you start wanting to come up with data usage metrics. We started with sort of like just a survey of things that could go wrong, but also gave consideration to some mitigations that could be made to avoid those pitfalls. And you'll see on this slide, and this will all be accessible kind of afterwards, I hope, the sort of links to the various outputs from those particular discussions, which I'm not going to necessarily go into detail in this overview. The end result of this was a set of recommendations, which are now officially endorsed. And I'd like to acknowledge the RDA Secretariat for their help in guiding us through the process, and also make sure I credit here Daniela, who has pretty much driven this, been the main driver of this process throughout the lifetime of the Data Usage Metrics Working Group. Now, the recommendations probably stretch to about 2 pages, so they're not long and they're not detailed. But on the next slide, I'm going to summarize them on just one slide. The first observation we made is that there was a lot of interest in this topic. This was evident from the number of people who turned up to the sessions that we held at RDA plenaries to talk about this, sometimes rooms that were overflowing. But I think what struck us was the contrast between people willing to actually sort of like talk about this, and then the sort of level of activity and engagement that we got sort of between plenaries. And I think this can be attributed to the fact that reliably measuring data usage metrics is complicated. And something that came through from the survey was sort of that there are activation barriers to actually implementing these sorts of metrics. People were interested in it, but they didn't necessarily feel it was a priority for them, or they didn't have the time to implement it. The good news is that if people do want to implement it, as we were having these discussions, there were various projects going on that were looking to come up with the standards and tools that hopefully make it easier for people to implement data usage metrics for a repository. And this is another recommendation captured, which is that these tools should be adopted. They include the counter code of practice, which lays out how to reliably count views and downloads so that you're offering a faithful representation of how a data set is being used. Recommendations that have come out of the Make Data Count project, and services that DataCite have been developing about how usage reports can be captured. And we're going to hear more about those later in the webinar. Another key point that we made in the recommendations, though, relates to those pitfalls, and sort of data usage is nuanced. And I think a kind of recurring theme in our discussions was this fear of us ending up with an impact factor similar to that which has been used, or should we say misused, for measuring the impact of articles. And we recognize that there's still work to be done to understand and overcome shortcomings. And this kind of leads on to the last point on this slide, is that there should continue to be a data usage metrics community and discussions about this within RDA. And it should work closely with other initiatives. And we've sort of exemplified here Scholix, which is all about linking data sets to articles. And I think these are 2 important strands of the same goal, which is to incentivize data sharing. Initiatives like Scholix lower the technical barriers. I think we're having reliable ways to measure data usage metrics, and data, the impact of sharing data generally helps show the value of doing. So that in a nutshell is the data usage metrics recommendations. There may well be questions and people might want to know a little bit more, which we can cover in the Q&A. But for now, I will stop there and hand over to Daniela.
Thanks, Ian. I'm going to take over your screen. There we go. Apologies, my computer is acting funny. Great. Okay. So as Ian mentioned, I've been co-chairing the RDA Data Usage Metrics Working Group. Ooh. There we go, with Ian for the last couple of years. And we wanted to give a little bit of background also into Make Data Count, as Make Data Count was really the driver of this data usage metrics working group, and to be able to push forward the initiative, especially in light of data usage. So for those who don't know, Make Data Count is a scholarly change initiative. We're focused on ensuring we can build open data metrics. You can see in the dark blue the things that we do, which is we build, we advocate, we contextualize. And in the teal, our values are that we're open, transparent, and responsible. And our goal is to develop open data metrics that can be used throughout the communities. And we're a community of organizations, including Crossref, DataCite, California Digital Library, bibliometricians, and others. And so our goal is really to build evidence-based data metrics that are useful in advanced science. Some things to really break this apart to make it clear. We're an initiative, so we're in a collective of organizations. We have built and leveraged standards. So ones you may have heard of, like Scholix and the Counter Code of Practice for research data, that's very specific to this data usage, are ones that we were involved in or led the development of. And those standards are what we use to develop the best practices for assessing data, so that we can eventually get to a space of having responsible research data assessment metrics. So what we really know about this and what we're trying to drive is saying that open data metrics are very powerful for incentivizing and understanding the ROI of research data and all of our investments in it. And the big key factor here is that we need an open corpus of views, downloads, and citations, but specifically in this context, we need views and downloads. And so we know folks have been really focused on data citation, and we started this data usage metrics working group to be thinking specifically about views and downloads and understanding how we could assess that. And you can, think about how different things would be, say, in a general repository, a download versus, say, Ian at CCDC, and what it looks like when you're using crystallography data. And so our group has always been focused on understanding the different usage of data usage. So across the disciplines, what does that look like? And so this building block we think is really essential to getting to this point of data metrics. And that's why really investing in RDA and data usage was important for us. We see this all as a journey. Step one, of course, was getting those best practices. So things like the code of practice for data usage. And right now we see that we're really stuck in this adopt best practices. And so what we really need to do is find easy ways to be able to get forward, to understand data metrics, enable them for evaluation, and then start to use them for incentives. And so thinking specifically about data usage, and what Christian and Matt are going to get into is thinking specifically about the log processing service, how we could make repositories processing their data usage as easy as possible. And I'll let Christian go on into that. We're also versioning the Counter Code of Practice for research data. So we put that out in 2018, and we've heard a lot of different use cases that we need to be thinking about that weren't covered in the first one. So a lot of complexities of data, especially thinking about data that is used in non-traditional ways, or data that aren't publicly available, but are restricted available. So we have a working group right now with Counter thinking through that. And then we need to be thinking a lot about complex metadata. There's a recording on the DataCite site and Twitter that you can find from a webinar that we just hosted, actually, about what the issues with the metadata we're seeing around data usage are at DataCite. And so our biggest message right now is that perfect is the enemy of good, and we got to get started. So we hope repositories and folks working with repositories will understand that data usage is essential for us to be standardizing and normalizing. We used to show in RDA sessions and working group meetings, we would say it's comparing apples and oranges if you looked at the views and downloads at one repository versus another. And so, we really have to make sure that everyone is normalizing their data against a code of practice, that we're all doing this the same way, so we can start to move forward. And we do have a team of bibliometricians that are starting to work on this, led by Stephanie Houstein and Isabella Peters. And they're looking at trying to understand how folks are reusing data. And a lot of this is looking at this usage. And so they are beginning to develop surveys, and we'll have papers soon on the topic. But that was kind of another piece of this is, as stakeholders in the RDA community, it's important for us to think about contributing data usage so that infometricians and scientometricians can start to think about, how our data being used. And so that's a big project that's happening right now. And so with that, I wanted to just use this as a preface and pass it over to Matt at DataCite to kind of give a perspective from DataCite. So Matt, over to you.
Thanks, Daniela, and let me share my screen. Just give me a moment. Sorry, just a moment. I was in the challenge doing it off an iPad. Just checking that everyone can see my screen. If somebody can just let me know just verbally, sorry, I can't see anyone.
Yes.
Okay, great, thanks, Ian. So I'll speak briefly and then I'll hand over to Christian. For those of you that don't know DataCite, we are a global community. We have organizational members across 50 countries that come together under a not-for-profit association that is registered in Germany. Our role is really in providing services for the community around a vision of connecting research and identifying knowledge. And when we talk about that vision, what we are talking about is bringing together the disparate pieces across the research lifecycle. And very much core to that is efforts around data metrics. And so a focus around that. So we are focusing on putting in place the building blocks for this to happen through services, and in turn bringing rigor to the scholarly record that is available to the community in an open infrastructure. Last year we did an extensive effort working with the community to do a bit more around our vision, and I wanted to briefly touch on this because it is important to understand how we are building out infrastructure, how we are using the infrastructure to make these efforts simple and easy for the community. And so we have a very clear vision around providing these persistent identifier services that really focus on making outputs and resources findable, citable, connected, and reused. Within that, we have 3 key pillars, and I'm going to focus on one pillar that really relates to our efforts around data metrics. And so this is specifically the pillar around connecting scholarly resources through metadata, and this effort that I mentioned around bringing rigor to the scholarly record to track research influence, so to understand what is happening with the research outputs and resources that institutions have and produce and researchers actively use in the community. And within this pillar, we have 5 key areas of activity. The first is focusing on the quality of metadata and doing this through providing insights to our members indicating where there's gaps and how we can enhance and enrich that metadata, and also looking at our schema that we use and how this can support these efforts. Secondly, then moving into the PID graph that we've developed, and this is really around relational metadata, and so a lot of this focuses on data citation, looking at dashboards and visualizations so that the community can easily use this information in their workflows and implement this into their day-to-day activities. Thirdly, looking at statistics, metrics, and this specifically for this webinar, looking at usage log processing. And I mentioned really a focus on making this simple, making it easy. I really like that Daniela mentioned that we need to get started. It's not all perfect, but it is not too complex that we can't get started, that we can't start using these services and benefiting from this as a community. This also then speaks into the fourth point around supporting fair implementation, making that fairly straightforward, integrating into the workflows of institutions. And then finally, the fifth area of activity in enhancing discovery solutions around this connection and reuse of research data. And so with that, I'll hand over to Christian, who will now talk a bit about some of the services and tools, and specifically the usage processing service that we are developing and have a proof of concept, and the direction that this is going and how the community is going to be able to benefit and implement this very soon. So over to you, Christian.
Thank you, Matt. Can you hear me well there? I guess you can. Yeah. Excellent. Thank you, everybody. Well, let me just go back a little bit to what Daniela and Ian mentioned at the beginning, and just to explain a little bit about this service that we have been working on. So for a couple of years, everybody that made the account project have been working to establish this framework for managing credit around research outputs with UIs, specifically these data sets. And that framework, as Daniela and Ian mentioned, found the ideas of how to best share, process, and consume usage, and also citation metrics around research data outputs with UIs. Specifically with usage, as it was mentioned, we established this code of practice on processing usage and sharing usage metrics, and also consuming them. And there has been some moderated success to this approach, and I think Ian mentioned, and we have established, we've identified some areas that need considerable improvement. There was conducted, one of those problems is related with adoption. And let me talk a little bit about what we currently have, and that we currently have for processing data usage. A repository will need to build a weblog processor according to this code of practice specification. We have looked at a few implementations of this approach, and in average, that will take a few thousand lines of code, a couple months, and a few people to get this implemented and running. We don't think that this is a crazy approach, but many repositories do not have the resourcing and to spend resources to standardize their usage data. And they have mentioned this as an adoption problem. So in this current iteration of the project, we have been aiming to change that. And with that in mind, we started to think in a new solution of approach to this usage processing. And I guess we can move to the next slide. Oh, well, I mean, this is, the approach. But this solution is to provide a service that will process data usage from our repositories, rather than make the repositories actually being the ones processing all of that. And in essence, we will try to move the burden of using processing to DataCite and free into this DataCite service, and free the repositories from investing in development processing capabilities. And can we go to the next slide? So in broad terms, the objective with the new approach that MDC is following is that our objective is that repositories don't need to invest more than a few hours in their setup. They will need a minimal coding requirement, required coding. So that means that less people will need to be involved, and implementation will be faster. And that's what the approach currently to improve adoption of usage metrics relies on. Next slide. So this solution is meant to be a DataCite hosted service based on open technology that accepts usage information from web trackers. I think this is very similar to web analytics trackers such as Google Analytics, and that's kind of the approach that we are following. This service will process all the usage, unlike Google Analytics, will process it according to this code of practice that we have been developing. But it will have a narrower focus, and practically that means that we'll focus on typical user behavior. So that behavior that users going to web pages to actually use a data set will have. One thing that we also are really conscious currently is that we have to design this service to never store personally identifying information, because it's a very important core thing in this process. And so with that in mind, and that's being in this approach, I would like to show you a little bit of kind of a walkthrough of how this service prototype will work and how we look in the long term, but I also give you an insight of how currently in which step are we in, how currently is working. So can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So as a user of this service, you will need to have a repository that needs a DataCite device for datasets. And you will need to enable this process service for all your DOIs. And when this is done, you will have access to a code snippet and a tracking code. This will be a tracking code for your repository. And this code snippet is to be placed by the repository or you in the DOI landing page of your DOI. And basically simple as a copy paste into each of those landing pages. And the only thing that requires technical work is to put this there, including your tracking ID for your repository and the DOI name of each landing page. I'll give you an example to show like that if we go to the next slide. Thank you. Can we go to the next slide, Matt? Sorry, thank you. So this is landing page from Metadata, and here you can see the code tracking snippet in the and embedded in the HTML of the code. In the anatomy of this, it includes only the tracker ID of the repository and the DOI name of the landing page. And the DOI the landing page obviously needs to be replaced by the repository code to actually every landing page to have the DOI. But with that simple step, where our processing service will take the information every time that someone goes to this landing page and send the user information back to the DataCite. And our service in the backend will be processing all the information according to this code of practice. And nevertheless, I mean, like even this could be considered like, oh, well, you still need to do some coding, and that might still be an adoption barrier for some of our repositories out there. But, and we go to the next slide, Matt. If any of these repositories already embeds DOI metadata or using schema.org or Dublin Core, you wouldn't actually need to add any DOI name. So you could put the tracking code just with your repository ID with it, and that will be practically done. We will take care of everything. Our code will take care of identifying the landing page that belongs to every DOI and then send information so we can track it. And with those two steps, we are tracking. Will be tracking all that information. That goes things like, well, we are tracking now, but how can you access all the usage metrics that are being tracked and processed? And for that, we actually we have already a set of interfaces that can be used, and I will just talk a little bit about them. So we go to the next slide. Next slide, sorry. So all these particularly views and downloads get collected, and they will be input into the pipe, which contain many services, but I won't mention them here today. In this pipeline, there will be a number of interfaces. I'm going to just mention a few of them. We actually have DataCite Fabrica, which is the main service for all repositories that administrate DOIs with DataCite, and that's a place where you can see these metrics. Also, web interfaces such as DataCite Commons, where also will display all the processed information, and so that you can see it. And at the same time, we also will have like APIs and services side APIs, such as the GraphQL API from DataCite and the REST APIs, from which you can access to all these metrics programmatically. One crucial point to make is that processing usage takes, so not all that data processing happens instantaneously, but initial thought is that there's some buffer time between when the usage is collected and when this is in all the interfaces. And that could happen, I don't know, in a day. It's a little bit depending of how big it is. But with that in mind, I mean, this is kind of the walkthrough of all this. I think this is my last slide, if I'm not mistaken. Oh no, I think I have another one, right? Can we go to the next one? Yes. So the service is not completely out, but what we do have at the moment is a prototype service. We expect that when the actual service is launched, hundreds of repositories will be able to take advantage of the quick setup and start processing data sharing. Today, we have a proof of concept. They're already working, and it is already working. It's including partial functionality, what I had mentioned. This proof of concept is currently only available for Make Data Count partners, and the data collected is only available in one of those 5 interfaces. In a few more months, and if we go to the next slide, we will be releasing a minimum viable product of this service with a further release later in 2022. And we expect that by 2023, we will start onboarding, I mean, every repository that wants to use data processing according to this new service. So they can, all of those ones that have DataCite DOIs can start getting all the data processed. There is a link on this slide, and I trust that someone can copy it in the message box, because if you are interested in seeing how this progresses, there is this roadmap page in which you can actually see every time that we make a new release. Yeah, but I think that's all for my part. I think we can hand back to Ian or Daniela.
Thanks, Christian.
Thank you.
So I saw that. I think we're going to open it up to questions to all of us here. I noted in the Q&A we have a couple of questions. The first is about data citations. I'm going to answer that in that, typing the answer and try and keep this focused on data usage. Sometimes we overstep in our boundaries. But a question from Stefan about using hosted data repositories. Does DataCite plan to work with repository platform providers or institutional platforms so that they can use this service? And I see someone else has also said, have you thought about using the vendors and folks that are using vendors for their data repositories?
Yes, I can jump in, and Christian can also add. We have a registered service provider program where we actively work with the technology providers. They do a self-assessment each year, but also importantly, as part of that, we talk to them regularly and coordinate implementations of new services. So this will be one of the things that we will be working with those technology providers to do, so that, again, supports and accelerates adoption. Again, I think I'll add that this approach takes very minimal implementation work. It really is to really increase adoption and make it really simple and easy. And so depending on how you've got it set up, it's really putting in the snippets, in some cases putting in the DOI name, in other cases, as Christian mentioned, if you've implemented schema.org as an example, you don't even need to put in the DOI name into the landing pages. And so that makes it really easy and simple, but we will also do the work with the service providers.
That is great. Other questions, you folks want to put them in chat, in Q&A? Is it clear what we're kind of talking about here? I know we've been working on this working group for a lot. So was there jargon that we're talking about? Are there things that would be helpful for us to clarify about kind of how we got here for thinking about processing usage at repositories? Quiet group, though there's a lot of you here.
People can raise their hand if they want, and I can unmute if you'd rather ask a question directly. Okay, Michael Witt. I unmuted you, Michael. Did you have a question? You're muted. I mean, oh, there you go.
Sorry, no question. I just
Oh.
I tapped the button accidentally. Forgive me.
Oh, okay, thanks.
So we got another question talking about how an organization uses a metadata catalog as the entry point for accessing data sets, where each data set is made available via dedicated separate website. And they're wondering, can you place the DataCite JavaScript via view counter on both the websites, the entry point, and the website hosting the data? So the DOI landing page is associated to the website hosting the data, not the metadata catalog. Christian, I'm looking at you.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. Okay, so if I understand correctly, I mean that you have one place where you can download the data set and the other one where you can, where is the landing page? Is that correct? Yeah, would that be fair to say? Yes. Actually, it's good because we have been dealing with this issue later last year on the findings, and you will be able, there are basically two trackers, depending, you can put both in the same page if that were to be the case. But you can also, and one deals with the downloading data and the other one with the view of the landing page. And you can actually separate them both too. And the only case in that, the only consideration there is that you do have to, the other page has to have a way to get the DOI name. This is the same one that the landing page. But yeah, it will be possible. Yeah, as is described there in that question.
There is a question in chat, Daniela.
Yep. So Jason wants to know, are there plans to have impact scores that can be attributed to not only the DOI, but the authors and owners of the DOI? So maybe Matt, do you have any thoughts on that?
Sorry, just looking for the unmute button. Yeah, I think we need to work this out, I guess, as a community a bit. We need to think about what the right approach is. Sorry, I'm just looking for the question specifically. I like to use, personally, this is more of a personal thing, influence at the moment. I think the core of it is, what do we mean by impact scores specifically? That can be attributed certainly to individual authors linked into the DOI, but I guess the question is, where does that end up and how's the community using that? Is that getting fed across into, say, an ORCID record, or are we displaying it in some sort of profile? I do see, I guess, the fundamental building block piece is, let's take the first step and get the usage metrics into the infrastructure. How we use it and build on top of the APIs, I think, is something that we can evolve as a community and establish best practice around. So I would say more specifically, and I know I'm rambling here a bit, that there's no specific definitive plans and agreement around this, but it's something that there's ongoing discussion about. And once we have this implemented and adoption reaches a point, then we can start to do a bit more work on some of these things. So I hope that I've kind of addressed your question. I know I didn't specifically give you an answer, but hopefully that gives you some context, Jason.
Thanks, Matt.
I mean, if I can just add to that a little bit, I think, you know, I was kind of struck by those comments earlier on about, you know, the important thing is to start getting things out there so we can start to see what sort of questions and insights we can get from having a look at these usage metrics. And I think we should be careful not to jump too far ahead until we've got the data to understand what it is that it is telling us, because straight away, you know, channeling some of the sort of discussion that came up in the course of the working group, it's kind of different numbers are going to appear for different disciplines in different contexts, etc., etc. And so, you know, how do you usefully combine these to come up with a score? What does that score actually tell you? And I think we need to get the kind of collect the numbers so that we can start to understand how we can use this to demonstrate that important thing about impact.
Definitely. I know that there's a comment in here in the questions about citation does not equal reuse as a question. And it's just that we're thinking a lot about this as, you know, originally when we developed this group, Scholix was very popular, and that's the data citation working group. And so we wanted to shed light on other ways of assessing usage of data. So not necessarily, you know, we don't know that a view equals reuse of the data, but we did want to capture ways of even the usage of the data, and usage and reuse could be different in this terminology, and it gets into semantics a bit, but that's why we're kind of focusing specifically here on other possible indicators like views and downloads. While at Make Data Count at large, we focus a lot on citations, and we could talk a lot about that. But in this group specifically in RDA, we've been focused on views and downloads. Any other questions? Okay, so another question here. Question linked to what Jason just asked. If you start collecting scores related to authors and organizations, there should be better placed respectively in ORCID, people, and ROR orgs, not shown dealt with in DataCite. Are you developing solutions to exchange collected scores with them? Matt, I think this is right within things we were just talking about. Do you want to touch on this?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think the path and where we're going with this is building an open corpus that the community can exchange and reuse this information. There's many different questions that need to be answered in terms of that the data can answer. And so we're not trying to build a central solution that answers all the questions. It's about being able to get the core information, so in this case the metrics, into open infrastructure and have a corpus that can be reused by anyone in the community. Specifically mentioning RAW as an example, obviously we use that in DataCite. We one of the governing organizations within RAW. It's core to our mission. We build in DataCite Commons as one use case using RAW and aggregate this information into an institutional view. ORCID as an example, both we allow for information to go to ORCID, but we also can reuse ORCID in context like the PID graph to say, show me an individual and all of this information related to the individual. And so I think the important piece here is that it's open infrastructure, open APIs, and the community has flexibility to build things that answer questions that they need to address within their workflows. I don't know if you want to add anything around this, Daniela, as well, just more generally from a community perspective.
No, I think just when I mentioned in the slides about metadata around data usage, something that Stephanie Haustein had shown, again, in the webinar that we're referring to, is that, you know, the metadata from repositories right now is not as great as it should be. We are not seeing the uptake of RORs and ORCIDs and funding information and disciplinary information like subject classification. And so this is actually information that should be collected at DataCite because it should be included in every DataCite record that's going over there. We need better metadata. So it is actually a responsibility for DataCite to be able to show that and for us to all be able to access that. And so one, push back to everyone here that's involved in data land is to start to think about how much better the metadata can be that you're submitting to DataCite or that you would want to be reusing from DataCite.
Daniela, we have one raised hand, Lindsay Anderson.
Yeah, Lindsay, unmute.
Yeah, I had an interesting thought, and I don't know if this is kind of discussed, with the topics of attribution and getting metrics from repositories, the ones using like an authentication service like ORCID. I mean, it's kind of an ecosystem compliance, right? So if I want to download some data that contains metadata and you authenticate through ORCID, could there be options where metadata tags that, let's say, DataCite uses, the download user supplies? So you download, but you can download almost, what about this data set entices you to want to use it or reuse it, where there are kind of like tag metrics built in with that. So you kind of get download feedback as well as analytics based on your own tagging system. And that could be an interesting thing where maybe if there's attribution for it, people don't mind, hey, yeah, if I download this data, I don't mind providing what about it I'm going to reuse or what I like about it or what it provides. So that could be an interesting thought.
Yeah, thanks for sharing.
Yeah, I think there is something interesting there. You obviously think about, I think if I understood right, some of the sort of privacy concerns around personal identifying information, but if you could at least track some demographics, that would be really, really useful. There's people who have done impact studies on open resources such as the EBI, and I think they've done it for environmental resources in the UK. And I remember talking to one of them that said the real challenge with assessing the impact of open data resources is we don't know who's using them. So if there's a way to capture some sorts of demographics associated with that could be interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I just wanted to add on that, I think interesting thought. And yeah, there's the sort of privacy element that's sort of at the back of my head is, we need to think about how that's handled. But yeah, I think there could be some interesting evolution of the tracking, and that could provide additional insights. Again, back to sort of let's get going and adopting and then using the tracking. And getting that into open infrastructure that's available for everyone to reuse. And when I say reuse, it's the information, the usage metrics that are coming through.
So we got another comment about, capturing other ways of how data have been distributed and used, and how it could be restrictive to be focused on views and downloads. And that was some of the pitfalls that we published through our working group. So I definitely recommend checking those out. And also to mention that we don't believe that views and downloads are the only indicators that we should be looking at. This group and this work was really because everyone was really focused on citations and tracking those, which is what the comment alludes to. And there was no work done looking at how to normalize the views and downloads that are happening at repositories, even though this is happening across other scholarly outputs. And so this group is not looking to say that the most important thing is views and downloads. This group we are a subsector of and contributing to the larger work towards data metrics, and we focus specifically on just that one part of it, which is the views and downloads. And that's what our recommendation that was just endorsed really outlines and makes clear. We're nearing the hour. Are there any last questions or comments before we wrap up?
A couple in chat. Danielle, do you see the ones in chat?
Yeah, they're just a couple comments I think folks are putting in.
Okay.
So if there's not any last questions, I mean, the recording will be made available, the slides as well, and our contact information. I'd say the biggest thing moving forward is clear to us we had to make something really easy to get this continuing to move. So we're really excited that DataCite is going to be pushing forward this service. And so, watch this space and join the working group if you want to. We're going to be going into maintenance mode, but a big thing we're going to be promoting is the service. And yeah, so if you have questions, please reach out to Ian and I about the group or to the DataCite folks about the service. And I guess I'll pass it over to you, Stephanie, to close it out.
Great, thank you so much. So I just have a little thing to close out. Can you see my screen? Great. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Daniela, Matt, Christian, and the RDA Data Usage Metrics Working Group for presenting today. We really appreciate that. I also want to thank those behind the scenes, Megan and Rebecca. Rebecca's helping record the French. Megan's recording the English. They're providing technical support. Lena Harper from the Digital Research Alliance in Canada for arranging our French translation services. And thanks to our interpreter, Yanitza Garnanu. Thanks to all of you for being here. A couple of housekeeping. RDA plenary is coming up. It's a hybrid meeting. Plenaries are typically held every 6 months. This one will be in Seoul, South Korea in June. Registration is open, so go ahead and go over to that website. We have upcoming webinars in this high RDA output series, May through November. So we have a lot of working groups going to be presenting their work. So mark your calendar, and you can see this on the website under upcoming webinars. Or actually, yeah, I'm not sure they're all posted yet, but they will be. We also have fun. We started a podcast series, and this is for new groups. So newly endorsed groups who will be presenting why they started a group. And we started it with episode 1 was the data citation working group, because that was one of our oldest working groups. And Mark and Andres are talking about that working group and how it went through. So download that from our Podbean. Anyway, you can go to the RDA Alliance podcast and see those. And then we have our first 4 new groups we're going to be recording in the next few weeks. That's been a lot of fun. And then the last thing I wanted to say is here are some RDA outputs. Some webinar websites for all of us. Hope you will join. We thank you so much for being here, and we'll hope you see you again on some future webinar. Thank you. Bye.